Hello and welcome, and thank you everyone for coming along today. Today we'll show you our presentation of our youth statement and also issues beyond what could actually be written on paper. We plan to focus on emotions, so beyond the math, trade-offs in the context of ideas, and most importantly, how and why youth should be engaged in this debate. 2 hours ago, we set out to capture on camera what some of Wellington's youth thought about the current issues facing New Zealand.
So what do you think of superannuation, just as an idea?
I think it's a pretty good idea.
Yeah? What if I told you that a quarter of all the money that the government gets from taxpayers is spent on people above the age of 65? What do you think about that?
Of all the taxes,
All the tax.
25%.
25%.
I think that's a bit mental, actually.
Were you surprised by that?
I was, yeah. I didn't think it'd be that much. You know, it is a lot of money at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah. What do you think? 25%. What do you think of that?
That's a bit much.
Shock to this, is it?
Yeah.
I think I would say that that was a little bit high though. I don't think maybe 25%, yeah, I would say it's a little bit high.
A little bit shocked at how high that was?
Yeah, just a bit, man. Like, I'd say 25%, they might be overdoing it just a little bit, yeah.
I want to say okay, but it's old people.
Good afternoon, I hope you all enjoyed our video. We would actually like to introduce you to one of our friends. His name is Terry, and Terry is your typical young New Zealander. He likes dining at McDonald's, skating and long walks along the beach. But Terry knows that the beach might not be there forever unless we take action now. Unfortunately, Terry is unable to make it today, but we do have some of his thoughts that we'd like to share with you. Terry's first thought is that the future is not one generation's to take. I would hope that most, if not all of you here, will agree with this statement, as well as sharing our 6 key values, which are outlined in the long-term New Zealand youth statement. We recognise that New Zealanders, regardless of age, share common values such as unity, diversity, responsibility and equality. However, we believe that it is important to emphasise that current policies are jeopardising these values. As it currently stands, our generation is being robbed of our financial security. Everyone seems to feel entitled to their superannuation, yet not one of us standing before you believes that we're going to receive a similar scheme when it comes time for us to retire. Right now, we're being forced to fund our grandparents' retirement as well as save for our own future. The reality is that in the current economic and political environment, despite any good intentions, we're being robbed. There is extreme intergenerational inequality. However, this isn't the end. Action can be taken now to save our future.
Terry believes your choices are our consequences. In other words, today's choices are tomorrow's consequences. A quote from Sir Michael Cullen really resonated with Terry. We should not leave our children and grandchildren with harder choices than we are willing to make for ourselves. So what we do today, Treasury, youth and New Zealand as a whole, is going to affect future generations, such as Terry's grandchildren. Therefore, we need to be working together in order to achieve common goals. If we take action now, we can implement gradual changes rather than having to respond to big shocks. Gradual changes will be easier to implement than having to respond to shocks. If we don't act now, it's no longer if big shocks will occur and affect Terry's grandchildren, but when they will. To paraphrase Elvis Presley, our friend is aware that there is too much talk and not enough action. We all have ideas. We as youth, politicians, as teachers and construction workers. But the shoulds and maybes need to be changed to wills and definitelys. Small adaptations now will relate to impacting and long-lasting future changes, helping us to avoid shocks and to become more resilient as a nation. Terry, his family and his friends want to have the knowledge and safety
that their views do matter and will lead to positive forces.
According to Terry, future generations are calling on us to move beyond economic growth. In other words, he thinks we should look beyond the maths. Maths such as Terry, when he leaves university, will probably have approximately 50 grand on his student loan, which he has to pay off before he can even start saving for his retirement. Also, he understands that we have issues like our government debt, because we have sheep and cows in New Zealand, so we don't want to be like the pigs. But he also thinks that social issues are at least as important as the fiscal issues. Carrie was talking about how he understood that the beach might not be there forever, but if we look after our environment in a sustainable way, the beach might still be there, as nice as it is today, for Terry's grandchildren. Things like income inequality that are in New Zealand now need to be looked at before the income gap becomes irretrievably wide. Also, there's issues that straddle the two, like healthcare and education. They're social issues, but they needed to be funded with government money. So, whilst social issues are important, and we need to look at these, but these are funded by the fiscal issues.
So why this emotive response to intergenerational equity? Well, our generation is the first one where the net transfers are going to the past instead of to the future. And with the current policy mix, this is expected to continue. We believe it is a value of our society to invest in the future, and that future generations should have equal, if not better, living standards than the ones before them. We commend your living standards framework, and we understand that there must be trade-offs. But we urge the Treasury to be adaptive, bold, and explore alternatives so that we can continue to invest in future generations. At the end of the day, that's a value that we all endorse, and it is the best business decision.
So we think Treasury's Living Standards framework is the right framework for looking at this issue, how we can make New Zealand better for the next generation. It's a progressive, holistic framework that can be used to assess the real health of the economy now and into the future. And this concept of health is really apt, because we see the role of Treasury as something like a doctor, examining the patient, New Zealand and its economy, and making a dispassionate, evidence-based assessment of its health and the potential remedies. Now, the key to a good doctor-patient relationship is good communication. And we think the key to addressing New Zealand's long-term fiscal and economic challenges is that we have a well-informed societal discussion, a frank and open discussion about our future. As your patient, we want to know the prognosis, but for a good decision, we really need to know what the treatment options are, how effective they will be, and any potential side effects. Treasury as an institution is the best place to do this analysis, and we think will facilitate that conversation. So now I'm going to hand over to Louis to give a perspective on how we think the Treasury is performing in its role as the doctor.
Wow. We're aware that some of this could extend beyond the scope of a fiscal statement. The Public Finance Act mandates very much a statement on the fiscal position, but we think that if Treasury is genuine in its concern to engage with the public, that it's important to move beyond simply a narrow set of fiscal projections and also explore wider ramifications of that. And there's two things I'll talk about briefly. The first is the diagnosis. So how well has our doctor diagnosed the economy? We think the fiscal statements in the past have been reasonably effective at projecting historic trends and saying we've had 7% annual increases in justice expenditure, and based on that we can make a prediction about going forward. The two things we think probably aren't being looked at, one is potential shocks to that, and we accept that having a reasonable, prudent debt level prevents that, but we think there should be explicit recognition of the kind of shocks that New Zealand economy faces from things like Christchurch but other ones. The second is whether or not the framework adequately captures other new costs, and two in our minds would be obviously the earthquakes one, but also potentially a carbon price under any international emissions agreement. both examples, but of things which, although not historically present, if you look backward, certainly an issue if you look forward. In terms of the options, so how well is the doctor not just diagnosing, but suggesting future steps, we think that we need to assess options against the living standards framework. So I think the next step in this conversation is not just to lay out the issues, but to take the trade-offs that would be necessary to respond to things like rising superannuation costs or rising health costs, and look at how different mixes of policy responses would impact on the different factors in the living standards framework. What trade-offs would be required if we were to raise superannuation, and what would be the impacts on the different aspects of it, on equity versus social infrastructure, and how they would provide for other things. So we think there's a solid platform, but we think to engage the public, the Treasury can do more to broaden the scope and examine the potential trade-offs it can do.
As a doctor, we believe in preventive medicine and trying to attack the problems before they become problems. We live in a country where we have made leaps and bounds in education and other social aspects, but we have failed in some other areas such as financial literacy and entrepreneurship. Our Minister of Finance has stated that eventually the only answer is going to be entrepreneurship and trying to create a culture amongst our people where we can create more money rather than borrowing money or making cutbacks. Also, we need to be educated. We need to get into schools, we need to get to youth, and we need to get to those who are actually going to feel the effects of a long-term fiscal statement. I believe, and I know, that the Treasury can help us to reach our goals and help us to do our very best, and that the responsibility is on us as a nation, and us in our trying to become financially literate and trying to instill an entrepreneurial culture inside our own people, and us taking our responsibility for affording our future.
Kia ora guys, and I'm going to be talking about youth engagement and what the things that Treasury can start doing tomorrow to start engaging with young people. And so one of the, I just don't want to be discreet. One of the things that we sort of definitely want to advocate is that there's a big difference between being uninformed and being apathetic. And that a lot of young people can't go out and read the 2009 fiscal statement. And so we need to find ways, easily digestible ways for young people to get engaged in these sorts of things. And so we definitely need to go out and combat these perceptions of apathy amongst sort of the older generation and amongst decision makers. Because young people do care, and young people are inherent stakeholders in these sorts of decisions. As has been said previously, is that we are going to inherit, and our children are going to inherit, the sort of ramifications of today's choices. And so we need to make sure that we are giving them a better deal than we ourselves have been given. And so they have a vested interest in this conversation. And so what we have here is we've developed sort of a rough framework that I'm sure Treasury can develop on how we can sort of move people from being uninformed to engaged, which future speakers are going to be talking about. And something that we just want to emphasize is that our video took us half an hour on the streets of Wellington with one camera. And we got some quite good responses. We educated people, we made them informed, and we made them question and have an opinion based on asking them 3 questions and taking like 30 seconds of their time. And so, based off that, with the government and Treasury and the full powers of the Crown, we're sure that the government is actually able to go out and reach and move people from the uninformed to the engaged and active decision makers and participating in these sorts of decisions. So yeah, we'd like to move on to John to talk about some of the options.
Right, so the biggest group of people are the uninformed youth. They're also the hardest to reach. As Jason said, this doesn't mean they're apathetic to the situation. They just don't know anything about it. We think Treasury's goal should be to raise awareness, firstly, in this uninformed group, and then move them, increase their knowledge to a point where they can reasonably say they're informed. How does Treasury do this? Well, the first thing they could do is create a video much like we've done. They've got a lot of laughs, it was entertaining and people would watch it. Treasury could increase the fiscal focus of the school curriculum. They could make visits to university classes. They could make visits to high schools more. And lastly, they could make a game like the US budget simulator Sim City. You can make it fun to learn about fiscal strategy. Or funner.
Okay, somehow when we were lining up, I broke legs with my group, but it's okay. Alright, so now we're moving on along the continuum to increase informed youth. So the informed youth is interested and curious. They have a working knowledge of fiscal issues, but they lack the platforms to engage in fiscal dialogue with the decision makers that are going to inform and affect their future. So the question now becomes, how do we build these connections with decision makers, e.g. Treasury, so youth can get their voices heard? We came up with a loose game plan. So our starting point, up Treasury presence in high schools and universities, as John touched on. Someone, I can't remember who, basically summed it up as beat the Reserve Bank. I've talked to some of our group members and to some of my peers, and we have noticed that the Reserve Bank is quite present in high schools. We know about them, we hear about them, we visit them. Not so much Treasury, so that's something we could definitely work on. And the other thing is we could produce more materials in layperson terms. The fiscal state, the fiscal policy that Treasury has put out recently is better than its predecessor. It's more accessible. But as Jason said, it's still probably not something that a high schooler could pick up and understand. High school and university visits. These are important. Brief anecdote. I had a high school visit that almost turned me off the path I am right now, law and economics. So presenting a relatable and attractive face is important for getting youth used to it. I don't think attractive is So when you become aware of the institutions and are able to talk to them, that paves the way for them to become more engaged.
Engaged young people to actively participate in fiscal decision making. Currently, for government departments that want to engage with young people, they have the option of either going through MYD or doing it directly themselves. How MYD does it is they have regional groupings which they consult with, or they go directly with young people. But what we've seen Treasury done is Treasury has implemented the long-term schools challenge to engage with young people on the long-term fiscal plan, as well as this year the schools challenge for 2013, which really is great. However, Finn will sort of talk about, we'll sort of take the discussion to the next level in terms of what new methods we can explore to further youth participation in the process.
So just a few ideas we sort of came up with this morning, just spitballing for a couple of hours. We thought it's important to obviously get the voice of youth and let individuals know that their voice is important to the people at the highest level. So we thought maybe a scheme to encourage people to write submissions as members of youth looking at our fiscal future, and perhaps a way for Treasury, who have a much closer relationship with the Minister of Finance than any of us, perhaps a way for Treasury to take some of the best of these, or take the main ideas and present that to the Minister himself as a way of sort of communicating our ideas. Another idea we had was a dedicated, visible unit of youth affairs at Treasury, separating the general focus, as you talked about, MYD, of youth affairs groups, which are often on social issues and general sort of youth policy engagement, to something which is much more fiscal and economic based. And going back to the idea of schools and university visits, which we've mentioned a few times, we're wondering, why shouldn't we be encouraging people towards a career in youth issues and development? There's no reason why your 2 or 3 youth affairs advisors can't act as role models towards students who are unsure of their next step. Obviously, also their work output will benefit greatly from constant engagement with students' ideas and ambitions. And that's us essentially for today, but we want to present a small, unique gift. Julia?
At the conference we came up with this fiscal tool idea, and basically all the different ways we could change our fiscal budgets. I'd like to present this to you today.
Yeah, have any field questions from anyone? We're probably just going to stand here awkwardly while you do it. That's fine.
What do you guys think of the idea of maybe Treasury running an essay competition for university students? Or is that too expensive?
Great.
Oh, it
Great.
is, that one.
Value for money, so.
There's probably not enough writing in the essay, like in the economics curriculum in terms of essay writing. Like it does take until about 3rd or 4th year that we actually start building up that technique, so that'd be great to get feedback earlier on in the.
And the other thing with doing an essay is obviously if you want to win the competition, you've got to do your research, and so it would help people become a bit more informed. So I think that's a good idea.
You've talked about old people, and so did the video. I'm just wondering, is there a way we can connect youth and old people to also discuss the trade-offs that are involved?
That's what they're doing today.
That was basically going to be my answer. Mechanics that we've been talking about here, like just simple, easily digestible formats that you can get young people to get engaged with, and then older people can then read them and talk to, and then you can form smaller groups like this that you can sort of directly engage and discuss trade-offs with. Like, it's been a fantastic opportunity that we've all had to engage directly with Treasury. And so more mechanics like this, I think, are brilliant for getting that sort of that intergenerational discussion going.
If you want like a more institutional route, as in embedded in policy processes, then Colin James, who probably wrote the Calling on Future Conference, spoke about kind of constitutional people's assemblies as a mechanism which has been used. And I guess the Land and Water Forum, to a degree, is an example of government bringing together diverse stakeholders, and people would say that Scandinavian model of collaborative decision making has some merits at reconciling diverse perspectives, so we don't just end up telling old people they're stealing from us.
I think also too, we did kind of talk a little bit about the financial literacy and the fiscal literacy that we need to begin to understand our youth, so that we can come to understand what the older generation has been going through for the last 4 years, which we don't understand, and which we will once we come to the educated period.
I was wondering, could we have a look at, so a lot of your discussion today went focused on old people and their doing sort of making contributors potentially. I was just wondering whether you had actually thought about, because I mean, compared to my generation, actually, I think you guys, the industry provided all of the stuff that we can get. So, there is something about what is being provided for youth as well, and how do you think about that? I was wondering if you had thought about those issues as well, and whether you focus specifically on the older.
As far as the interest-free student loans go, a lot of what we put on student loans is actually our university tuition fees, which in the past had actually been free.
A long time ago.
A long time ago it was free. So I guess if you're thinking about old people, as in people that are retiring now, when they were at university, if they went to university, it was probably still it was free. So we probably got the same education, but they didn't have debt at the end of it, and whilst it's interest free, we do still have that debt when they come out at the other end.
Sorry. Have you talked to your parents and grandparents about this? Because presumably they're some of them are probably old people. And what do they think?
I feel entitled to superannuation, and I'm very against raising the age to which entitlement starts.
That's
do they think you have a point?
Yes, they do. They want to provide for the future, obviously, but at the same time, they don't want it to be at the expense of their superannuation.
If I can slightly contradict that, just as a personal example, when Rachel and I were in the taxi on the way to the airport after the conference, we actually asked our taxi driver, so what do you think about all of this? And he said that he actually has savings and that if he could opt out of his superannuation, then he would, and that it wouldn't really make a difference to his funds if he didn't have that payment there. So yeah, I guess that's just another perspective that's been going around.
I also wanted to add, I guess this is just a straw poll we've undertaken survey New Zealand, but my parents personally support regimes like raising the super age because they realise that it's going to impact beneficially on their children and their grandchildren. So I don't really like the us versus them rhetoric because we're all related as interconnected.
There's always a next generation.
Pardon?
There's always a next generation.
You guys are far too nice for a bunch of people who claim to be robbed. If you're looking at this puzzle in information terms alone, then what you're producing is some good suggestions. As this is a political economy problem, I want to know what you think you're going to do to actually get some rights here and some accountability for what's going down. If you want to talk about the fiscal, long-term report, then you're going to want some sort of a sectional or accounting framework that looks at intergenerational equity specifically and does some numbers on it. Something that gets you a stake at the table, something that gets you explicit recognition for this kind of grouping. I wonder what proposals you've thought about that actually get you some real mileage here.
I think my kind of proposal would be instilling that entrepreneurial culture inside New Zealand. And that is something that we really, we don't have a lot of. We have some of them, but the true answer to this is us providing for ourselves and taking the pressure really off the government and us having to become financially literate in order so we can pay for our own retirement. And if we can do that, if we can somehow instill something like, I don't know, maybe some programs or some money that can be poured into creating some entrepreneurial ventures, then we may be able to create more money for everybody and the tax revenues go up, all these types of things. That's just one option.
I want to ask a question about how your guys' thoughts on the role of Treasury, because I'm really interested to hear a couple of times you referred to Treasury as decision makers, which when we provide advice to democratically elected decision makers, and it's always a tension for government departments to maintain that political neutrality. And I think this is a fantastic initiative. I think it's great that we're talking about today. But do you feel in general that it's more important to engage with departments like us or to engage with politicians?
I think that there's like a definite mix, and it's through departments like Treasury that you get to politicians. Like when we talk as sort of individual young people to a specific politician, maybe our local MP or whatever, then sort of we don't really carry any weight. But when we can influence and talk to a big organisation like Treasury, and then Treasury can then sort of take it to a decision maker, you're going to get a lot more mileage out of that, and you're going to get a lot more sort of political force behind sort of any sort of change principle, rather than us sort of acting individually. And so, even though we might have referred to Treasury as decision maker, you might not believe yourselves to be a decision maker, but the decisions on what you guys include or not include in your long-term fiscal statement have long, profound effects on the political sort of nature and politicians.
Yeah, and that metaphor we drew with Treasury being the doctor is we were trying to, I guess, capture the role that we saw Treasury play there, and that yes, the doctor doesn't make a decision about the treatment. The doctor presents options for the patient and elucidates the effects of these and side effects and all that. And so I think our subgroup talked about how we like to encourage Treasury to be proactive with the public side of things and really try and lead the debate a little bit.
I'm going to draw this to a close. I just thought that was absolutely fantastic. Not just your presentations and sort of eloquence in which you've actually communicated with us, but actually the substance of what you've been saying. That was terrific. We're going to take it all on board. Any of you a target? Now, there's a guy who was just actually next door a few minutes ago. His name's Bill English. He's got kids at a target. And, so, make sure that sort of you communicate some of that stuff. But it's been terrific. Thank you for my presence. If I had it yesterday, I would have taken it to the meeting that we had at the Prime Minister's project. But thank you very much indeed.